Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people all over the world. I can see people have joined us from different parts of the world. So very thankful for your time today. I'm Siddhartha Khastagi. I'm head of verification and validation for intelligent vehicles at WMG at the University of Warwick in the UK. But in the ASAM setting, I'm the project lead. I have the pleasure and honor of leading the ASAM OpenODD concept project. And before I go into the project itself, I'd like to say a big thank you to Nico Dillman and Dorothy for all the help in setting up this webinar. So I really appreciate that. So what I'm going to do today is go through a very brief overview as to why we are doing the ASAM OpenODD project, some of the considerations from an ODD perspective that we have taken into the ASAM OpenODD concept project, and then talk to you a bit about the work packages that we have and the possible timeline that we have been working to. So from a motivation perspective, I think quite a few of you on the call would appreciate the need for a scenario-based testing. I think a lot of you have seen these numbers that have been thrown out in front of us over the last many years. We can't drive millions and billions of miles, so there's a need towards and a move towards scenario-based testing, and all the discussion we've been having from an ASAM perspective have more or less validated this concept. However, what is very interesting, and this is coming up more recently, is just saying scenario-based testing needs to be done is not good enough, because if your operating condition or if your area of deployment is, let's say, Phoenix, Arizona, then your scenarios in Phoenix, Arizona are very different to those in central London. So what is important here is not only scenario-based testing, but the link between scenario-based testing and the corresponding operational design domain of the automated driving system. So we've been talking a lot in the projects like OpenDrive, OpenScenario about trying to create scenarios, trying to create the world in which the scenarios would be executed. But there was this gap in the OpenX family of the standards around how do we actually define the operational design domain, and how can we actually link it to the other standards that we have like OpenScenario or OpenDrive, because the scenario, just creating scenario-based testing philosophy is not good enough for the reason that I've just mentioned. And I can provide you another reason. So here are two automated driving systems. Essentially, it's the same system. So both the systems have been developed by the same manufacturer. So one of our partners in the UK, Origo, it's essentially a low-speed automated driving system. But the operational design domain of the two systems are very, very different. The bit on the right you'll see is actually on the air side. Sorry, yes, bit on the right is on the air side of an airport, and the bit on the left is actually on a city center. So the kind of scenarios that we need to be using as part of a simulation-based testing is very, very different. So if we can create a methodology of going from operational design domain to scenarios, that bridges this gap, and that actually fulfills this gap that is already in there in this industry. Having said that, we have a way to define scenarios, or there is a way of defining scenarios using the OpenX family standards like OpenScenario and OpenDrive, but there isn't a way of defining the operational design domain. And I'll come to that in a minute again, as to scenarios are related to operational design domain, but they're not the same. So moving on, why can I not change this slide? Okay, why another reason ODDs are important. So we've just discussed that we have lots, we need to relate scenarios to operational design domain. Now, another ASAM OpenODD ASAM project, which is Open Label, which we had a webinar yesterday. You might have heard about having labels for scenarios in a database. Now, being able to link scenarios to ODD is a very efficient way of actually querying a very large database, which might have thousands or millions of scenarios, to actually extract the scenarios that are relevant. So trying to create some sort of tags or labels that are relevant to your scenario is also a very important part of how you implement a very efficient VNV pipeline. So that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of linkage between various OpenX projects, and we'll come to that in a minute in a few slides from now. So that's one of the reasons why you saw a lot of OpenODD or ODD flavor in yesterday's webinar on Open Label, because the ODD labels or tags are very important from a efficient extraction of scenarios from a database perspective. Now, we've spoken a lot about why is ODD important. What are the important considerations do we have from an ODD perspective? So one of the first things that I wanted to ensure that all of us on this call are on the same page, and I'll take you back to the first principles in a way, the definition of operational design domain, ODD, from J3016. I'm using the 2021 version. This should be, there's a typo, 2021 version, which was published in end of April. What I want to say is essentially the first two words of this definition are crucial. So an operational design domain is an operating condition. So whenever we've had all our discussions in the OpenODD project, concept project, we've always come back to this definition to say, if we are talking of a concept, is it operating condition? If it is, then yes, it is within the scope of the discussion. If it's not, then we'll have to make a case as to why we should be talking about it or not. One of the reasons why this is very important is distinguishing ODD from a scenario definition. So as I said, scenarios are related to ODDs, but they're not the same. And this definition allows us to reinforce that concept. But another thing that is very, very important from an operational design domain perspective and was crucial in an OpenODD discussion, from an OpenODD discussion perspective, is the concept of measurability of OpenODD, or concept of measurability of ODD attributes. So I have mentioned this as awareness. There's a specific reason for mentioning this as awareness. When we talk about the fact that, let's say, rainfall, we've already mentioned rainfall is part of an ODD definition. What do we mean when we say rainfall rate? Is it, so a lot of people might say light rain, heavy rain, medium rain. What does that actually mean? And who measures that? Is it like you measure it based on what you feel by putting your hand outside the car, or do you use an off-board weather station, or you use radar maps directly from, let's say, an organization like Met Office? So there's a lot of nuance is required when you are actually defining an ODD definition. And when we are talking about defining an ODD definition format, that format needs to consider and incorporate these nuances of being able to measure or these attributes that we are using. So we've mentioned, so for example, in the previous slide, I mentioned about, oops, sorry, I'm having some issues with my, yeah. So we mentioned about environmental or geographical or time of restrictions as possible attributes to an ODD. So we need to be able to measure or be aware of each of these attributes. And there are multiple ways of doing that, but from a format perspective, that is what our focus is in ASAM OpenODD project. We need to have that format be in a way that it can cater to these requirements. So a very simple example over here. Let's talk about a possible taxonomy for an ODD. That's not necessarily what we are using in ASAM ODD, and I think Nico Croce in Work Package 1's discussion will brief about a bit more detail. I'm just giving you a flavor of things that we need to consider. So you might say that we want to be aware of scenery elements. So things like lane specifications, signs, edges, road edges, etc. And that can be acquired from an HD map. Now, HD map is not part of the ODD definition format, but what is important is the ODD definition format that we are interested in from an OpenODD perspective needs to define these concepts in a way that is compatible to something like an HD map. Similarly, from a traffic perspective, we need to define traffic in a way that is compatible to how traffic management systems work. In an ASAM OpenX family, we need to come up with a language for OpenODD that is compatible with, let's say, OpenDrive, because essentially maps is what OpenDrive does. So those were the kind of considerations that we had to undertake as part of our discussions. Another important aspect that we have to consider is standardization is not just an ASAM activity. As Nico mentioned, there are lots of other standardization bodies all across the world. ASAM is just one of them. I've highlighted 3 of many that are out there, like British Standards Institute or the SAE International or ISO. So one thing that we at ASAM are very, very conscious of and absolutely follow is we do not want to do something that another standardization body is doing. Secondly, we do not want to create a standard that is contradictory to something else that is already out there. So one of the things that we've done, and I think Nico, Jason, Eddie, and Bernard would reiterate that we've always taken into consideration what is already out there. So in an ODD world, there's the BSI PAS 1883, there's a SAE AVSC lexicon, then there's work at ISO, and then there's work at ASAM. So when we were actually conceptualizing the ASAM ODD project, we absolutely wanted to fill the gap that was there. So all these 3 activities over here are focusing on taxonomy, focusing on attributes, focusing on system engineers' way of defining an ODD. However, there was nothing that was focusing on a simulation level ODD definition and being able to link it to the simulation-based testing pipeline. And that is where we as a community in OpenODD, ASAM OpenODD concept project pitched this concept and it was accepted by the stakeholders that we have. So from going on, so that was the motivation. So going on into the OpenODD objective and work packages itself. So our objective is fairly simple. We have a focus on simulation-based testing. We want to create a format that is capable of representing the operational design domain. It is important to mention here that we've said capable of representing the ODD, but we've not said that only the ODD. And I'll come to that point in the next slide or so. So our focus is on simulation-based testing. Now, if our focus is on simulation-based testing, it is very important that we consider this concept in the landscape of the whole simulation VNV pipeline. Now, if you think of the VNV pipeline, a verification validation pipeline of an automated driving system, essentially you need only 3 things. You need scenarios, you need a test environment, and you need to have a way of making an argument that it is safe or unsafe. Now, a lot of our focus right now in the ASAM world is actually on the scenario side of things. We do a bit of on the environment side, like OpenCRG, etc. But it's primarily we're focusing on the scenario side. Within the scenarios piece of activity, you can actually subdivide that activity into terms of creating scenarios like scenario generation, then formatting those scenarios, and then storing those scenarios. I don't want to go into the details of plan, execute, analyze, and decide, but essentially that's everything that you will do. So if you take a step back from ASAM OpenODD, and if you think of yourself as a VNV engineer or a safety engineer, all you need to do is create scenarios, format them, store them in a database, plan their execution, and then analyze and decide if the system is safe based on the results you get. But our focus right now is around this area, around the scenarios. So some of the OpenX standards or family of standards are dealing with some aspects over here. So you've got the format side, which is what OpenDrive is dealing with, OpenScenario is dealing with. So OpenDrive is more on the static side, or OpenScenario is more on the dynamic side, as you've seen in Nico's slide. And then OpenLabel focuses a bit around the storage of scenarios in a database. What was missing is actually taking a step behind the creation. So when you're creating something, and we've already said we are creating them in an OpenScenario and an OpenDrive format, linking it to the ODD definition is what was missing. and a format for an OpenODD definition, a format for an ODD definition was missing. So now what we're saying is the OpenODD for standard, when it gets published, would be an input to this pipeline that we have of create, format, store, plan, execute, analyze, and decide. It's not the only standard that you need to cater to, but it's one of the inputs to it. And because it's not the only standard, it is very important that this OpenODD standard actually is coherent or aligned or harmonized with the other OpenX standards that we have. So at ASAM, there is a big activity that we are right now undergoing in terms of harmonizing all standards, including OpenODD, with each other, like OpenLabel, OpenDrive, OpenScenario. And I think our other speakers, work package leaders, will actually go into details of how this process is happening. One of the important aspects over here is when you consider the VNV pipeline, it's not just the ODD definition that is important. It's the other aspects like measurability that we've said, other aspects in terms of risk analysis, that because you need to do that also from a safety decision perspective. And that's where we've actually slightly expanded the scope of OpenODD as a language to not just the ODD definition, but also other aspects that are required from a safety analysis perspective. So for example, one thing that is very much required is things like metrics. So how do you identify things like if my scenario is within my ODD or not? So those are the things like metrics that we need to include, or uncertainties. So when you are actually measuring an ODD attribute, especially weather, there will always be a level of uncertainty associated with that measurement. And that language that is actually defining the ODD needs to take that into consideration. And then there's some fairly basic things like maths and etc. So while we've got the ODD definition along with the taxonomy and ontology as the center of OpenODD project, the concept project, from a language perspective, we've also catering to these other bricks that you see. So if within the project team, we have this phrase of colorful bricks, which is the scope of ASAM OpenODD concept project. Having said that, that does not mean that the standardization project will cater to all of this. It might be a bit too much for us, but that is essentially what we are looking at right now. So going into a bit more detail, how does that picture of colorful bricks translate itself from a work package perspective? So we've got 4 work packages. Work package 1 essentially is trying to create the attributes that we use for the ODD definition, and Nico Croce, who would speak after me, would go into detail of how we are actually going about doing that. Work package 2 is actually talking about the core green block that you saw, which is around the specification format, and Jason Zhang, who's the work package lead, later on would talk a bit about that. Work package 3 is around metrics and measurement and how the safety analysis piece actually impacts that, and Bernard Kaiser from ANSYS would talk a bit about that later on. And then at the end, we've got this very interesting concept, which is very relevant from an safety analysis perspective of uncertainty, and Eddie Schlab would talk about this later on, and he'll be joining us from the Bay Area. So from a project timeline perspective, so we kicked off this project back in September last year, and the initial phase was essentially trying to bring all of us together in terms of ideas, and it was an ideation phase that we had. And since March, we had a very good set of ideas, and since March we've been looking at converging those ideas to more concrete concepts, and which all of us agree with as a project team. So right now we are here right at the end of the convergence process. And from next month, we are starting off the writing process with an aim to finish the full concept paper in September, with a group review in October this year, submitting to the November TSC for publication as a concept paper, with aim of a possible standardization project next year, sometime kicking off in January. So that essentially is the project timeline and the future plans. If anybody would like to have any ideas as to how they want to contribute, please feel free to reach out to me or to Nico Dillman, and we can guide you through that process. And that essentially brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, happy to answer them.
Thank you very much. I will collect all questions, Siddhartha, so we can have them in the end in the Q&A session.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Perfect.